My name is Robert Vaš and I'm the founder and president of Globsec. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the digital stage. I wish you were here in person in Bratislava, but we want to make sure that we create an excellent experience for you even without a physical presence. This is the second stage of a special three-stage concept of Globsec 2020 that we have introduced this year. The first stage kicked off during summer with a global digital brainstorming of hundreds of experts from around the world to identify the trends that were triggered and accelerated by COVID-19. Today, we are kicking off the second digital stage of Globsec 2020 Forum, and the third stage will pick up in October with our hybrid physical and virtual conference. Let me make three quick points. First, COVID-19 has accelerated the digital transformation of all of our institutions, including Globsec. The digital transformation created an opportunity for those who are not in the big cities, in the big centers. Because in the digital domain, the physical distance does not matter. It does not matter whether you are in Bratislava, New York, or Brussels. Because we can all participate at the same event, at the same exercise. Actually, we can better connect and combine the global intellectual power. We are not encumbered by traffic on the street or delayed by a train. We do not need to waste time commuting or traveling to the conference today. Second, the world will not be the same after COVID-19, and you all know this. This is not only a health crisis, this is a multidimensional and transformational crisis that is changing our world. It has triggered and accelerated trends that will have lasting effect on our lives and our international environment. We still do not know exactly how the world will look like after the end of pandemic, but we know that it will not be the same. We need to design new strategies, new reality, and that is why we have initiated a global brainstorming on the post-COVID world. The Globsec Megatrends brainstorming and subsequent report, to be published in September, will help to identify those trends and find policy solutions for them. Hundreds of experts have participated in this exercise so far, and you can still be part by filling up the form that you can find on our webpage, globsec.org. Third, during the pandemic, we have seen a huge crisis of international cooperation and international institutions. But we need international cooperation more than ever, because we cannot fight the global pandemic locally, only if we close down in our borders. I'm convinced that only together we can heal the world. So please stay with us for the upcoming 3 days and let us heal the world together.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, welcome to the first opening session of Globsec 2020 Digital Stage. Thank you so much to Robert Vaš for these introductory words. And indeed, many of the elements that were mentioned by Robert will be included in the opening session, of course, which is titled The World After COVID-19. I'm Ali Aslan, international TV presenter and a journalist, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this opening session. And as a Globsec veteran, I know that Globsec always manages to bring high-profile, thought-provoking speakers. And even though we unfortunately cannot meet in Bratislava, the digital stage is clearly no exception. I'm very delighted to welcome the President of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid, as well as one of the foremost global thinkers out there, Robert Kaplan, who also holds the Robert Strauss Hupé Chair in Geopolitics at the Foreign Policy Research Institute at the moment. And the pandemic, as Robert Vaz said, of course, correctly, has disrupted the way we socialize, we work, we govern, and this health and economic crisis has certainly far-reaching implications for our future. Madam President, let's get right into it. At the end of the day, you are, of course, leading Estonia, a nation of 1.3 million people. If we look at the figures, Estonia has a little over 2,000 cases and 64 deaths. Just judging by those numbers, seems to be quite a successful management displayed by your administration. Has COVID been the biggest challenge in your presidency so far?
Definitely so, if you look at the preparedness which nobody could have for this crisis. But indeed, overall, because we had a lot of warning here in North Europe, we have managed to protect our people a little bit better than maybe in other countries. Again, I am reluctant to say that it is anything but luck, because after all, pandemic started in Southern Europe, and hence we could learn a lot, prepare a lot better already. Despite that, of course, for us economically, Estonia is a small open economy, and 80% of our economy is related to exports. So, of course, it is a huge hit to our economy, which certainly and definitely means that there are challenges ahead. On the other hand, we are a digital services economy, and the fastest growing part of Estonian economy has been our startups. So maybe they can weather this storm really well.
Yeah, indeed. And many of those elements we will, of course, talk in more detail during this session. But let me go to Robert Kaplan. Robert, you're coming to us from Massachusetts. Quite a different story. Kersti Kaljulaid, the president, just said we've managed it quite well. Quite a different story in the United States. Almost 6 million COVID cases and 180,000 casualties. Now, of course, many presidents or all presidents are defined by the crises they are met. This could have been a very important moment in time for President Donald Trump. Has he risen to the occasion?
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here at GlobeSec, even though it's virtual. I wish it were in person. No, President Trump has not risen to the challenge. This was a particular challenge that required exceptional organization and direction from the White House. Organizing the responses of the various state governors, the various federal agencies, expert groups, etc., to do deconfliction and to kind of coordinate it all. So that required a very organized White House and White House staff, and President Trump's administration is the opposite of that. So it's been somewhat of a catastrophe. See, big countries like the United States can afford to make mistakes and have even bad government at times. It's much harder for smaller countries. They have no margin for error in this or many other geopolitical crises. It's interesting that President Obama, who had his faults, he certainly had his flaws, was a very cerebral, organized, obsessive man in many ways, and therefore this crisis, ironically, would have been perfect for his abilities. But crises don't always match the presidents that we get. So I think that the current president has not done well with this crisis, and that this is why, for the moment at least, opponent is way ahead in the polls for the November election.
And the November election, of course, is on everyone's mind. Before we get into the major trends that have emerged from this pandemic, Robert, let me just follow up quickly and say, looking at the socioeconomic problems that the United States is facing due to the pandemic, there are a lot of people out there who say that COVID, as a matter of fact, has actually exposed the United States, has exposed the nation with many socioeconomic shortcomings such as public health, inadequate labor protection, racial tensions, meaning has exposed the United States as a third world, first. Well, what do you make of this argument? Would you go as far as to say?
Look, comparison is the beginning of all serious scholarship and analysis. And just yesterday, it came out in a big, heavily researched piece by the Wall Street Journal that China's economy is moving ahead. It was particularly the very draconian measures against COVID that China took very earlier in the year, which of course is the luxury of authoritarian regimes, can do things that democracies can't. But nevertheless, due to the extreme draconian measures China took earlier in the year, China's economy is now opening up and is at the beginning of surging forward. They even see a positive growth rate for China in 2020 by the end of the year. So in comparative terms, COVID-19 has exposed the administration and American society to various weaknesses, and it has provided an advantage for America's chief geopolitical rival, China. So, and this is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg of how COVID is going to help some countries in areas of the world, hurt other countries and areas of the world in this, in this geopolitical competition we can get into a bit later, I assume.
For sure. And Madam President, we of course have to talk about Europe as well, the European Union. International cooperation is always a term that is being thrown around when talking about the Union. But we've seen very little cooperation within the European Union since the start of the pandemic, haven't we? We've seen, as a matter of fact, more nationalism emerging. Almost every country was out there fighting on its own. And a lot of international observers are saying that COVID has not brought the EU together. Quite on the contrary, it has increased the fragmentation within the Union. Would you concur?
No, Ali, you are long behind the curve. Just yesterday, for example, my government, together with other EU countries, have been able to start signing agreements for vaccine purchases, and we have agreements in place how we will distribute these resources, which will initially also be scarce, so that all countries will be able to benefit and make the most vulnerable groups and healthcare providers secure from the COVID-19. For example, let me remind you, Europe doesn't have a social pillar. Hence, all the work which European Union is doing in the social sphere is greenfield. Let me remind you that indeed, when initially the countries closed their borders in panic, and this was true panic, and indeed information was scarce about who is doing what, European Union and its Commission quickly started to organize green routes so that at least goods could pass through, and the transfer of goods resumed really quickly. Let me also remind you that European Union has some really good tools to fight this pandemic. For example, it has an EIDAS identification system which allows people from various and different EU countries to sign documents legally, so that we don't need to gather in the same room or go to the notary office in order to be able to keep doing business. But I would also like to respond a little bit to this question which was raised by Mr. Kaplan about democratic states' opportunities and possibilities in pandemics compared to totalitarian regimes. I've been talking to many high school students during this pandemic here in Estonia, and what we have collectively concluded is that totalitarian regimes may seemingly have easier ways to close down shops, close down streets, limit contacts between people and so on. But democratic nations, by disseminating information and convincing people, can make their societies in far more sustainable way, and with people feeling far less loss of freedoms to achieve the same results, which has been demonstrated very well by many countries in Northern and Eastern Europe. We have risen as a nation against this enemy. Yes, we have many political differences in this country as well, and our political debate is as fierce as is in US. But in face of this, disseminating information and making people really aware that this is the test of citizenship, the test of citizen responsibility. Each and every one acts according to their own risk matrix. And based on this risk matrix, we act together as a nation. And in 2 weeks' time, we see how we collectively manage. It's a huge lesson in citizenship and citizen responsibility. And this is how we have taken this lesson here. In addition, and again, here in Europe, we have been using a little bit. Haven't social market economies really had an advantage in general in this pandemic? Because our healthcare system is indeed this, it is a national good, it is a national healthcare system. It is not a high number of agreements, millions of agreements between people and companies to guarantee their healthcare. We don't deal with diseases only in these countries here in Europe. We deal with healthcare systems. And I believe this has shown in this pandemic some advantages.
Indeed, and Robert Vos and both President Kaljulaid have now spoken in length about some of the lessons that have been learned throughout this pandemic. Robert Kaplan, what are some of the lessons? What are some of the main trends that you have been observing since the start of the pandemic?
What I see is that historians love chapter breaks, and COVID-19 is a very symbolic chapter break between what I call globalization 1.0 and globalization 2.0. Globalization 1.0 is basically a good news story friendly to optimists. It's about the spread of democracy around the world, the spread of free markets, the creation and enlargement of middle classes, the eradication of extreme poverty in many parts of the world, about global supply chains, all of that. Remember, when the Cold War ended and globalization 1.0 started, nobody had iPhones. Nobody was even on the internet, practically. So globalization 1.0 is a good news story. Globalization 2.0 is different. Globalization 2.0, I would say, began before COVID-19, but thinking of COVID-19 as just, a symbolic chapter break. Globalization 2.0 is about the disruption of global supply chains, the creation of more national supply chains, the disentangling of the U.S. and China, the decoupling of the U.S. and China supply chains, about the rise of populism, the rise of authoritarianism, which we thought we had beaten, and also the rise, the formation of geopolitical rivalry, which the elite did not take seriously in the 1990s. We're entering a more fractured kind of globalization, as the US and China seem increasingly alienated from each other. And the US and Russia are extremely alienated. Their relationship is dysfunctional. And China and Russia are what I call very wary tactical allies. And so this is going to be a story that's less friendly to optimists like globalization 1.0, and furthermore, one other thing, which is crises put history on fast forward. What would take 5 years to unravel in Iran will only take 2 years. What would take 5 years to happen in the Persian Gulf and Israel would only take 1 or 2 years, and on around the world. So COVID-19 has ignited kind of crisis situations in so many dozens of countries. It's hard to grasp fully. The news doesn't have room for it. in a way. And therefore, once this pandemic subsides and people can gather in the streets more without feeling fear of infecting each other, I think we're going to see a world with a very high level of geopolitical activity and change. You remember Saudi Arabia and Iran both have very troubled regimes during a period of very low energy prices. There are great changes that are going to happen that will all be at least partially derivative of this pandemic.
Certainly, COVID-19 has not given us a breather on the international stage, evident by events in Belarus right now, obviously, in Hong Kong, in Mali, and so on and so forth. Jerzy Kaljulat, you just heard Robert Kaplan sort of putting it in long-term perspective and his expectations as to what the world will look like once the fog fades. Are you in agreement, or are there points that you would disagree with?
Well, first of all, I do agree with the acceleration of the various developments and with the shortening of technological cycle. Obviously, I mean this is there, and we can see it. I believe that the future perspective really depends more how we can make use of the good and positive trends which were already ongoing before the COVID crisis and which we could enhance if we are smart about it. And I'm here meaning that if I take this globalization 1.0 and the new globalization metaphor, then I would say that the new globalization relates to the services markets. The first wave of globalization was mostly limited to trade and goods produced in cheap parts of the world and therefore and then exported and sold in the richer countries. Now we see that with digitalization of the services, for example, if you need to watch, I don't know, warehouse temperature and humidity, or even a border of a country, you don't need to hire anybody from your own country. You can hire somebody from afar to monitor this situation. At the same time, in the delivery of goods, we see regionalization. This was ongoing again already before the COVID pandemic, and even before President Trump became the president, and the questions about how free the trade should be and how global the trade should be started to be asked again louder. This was ongoing mainly because new technologies allowed the production change to be changed this way, that somewhere somebody designed and then you could take this design out and somewhere.
Right. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I'm actually not hearing Madam President right now. Is it just me?
I'm not hearing either.
You hear me now?
I'm not hearing.
You hear me
either.
again, or you didn't hear anything?
There you go. There you go. I'm pretty sure there was absolutely no sabotage in what you were just saying to cover up what you were just saying. So let's hear it again.
Question just is, how long didn't you hear me?
I would say 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not too long. Then I would start from here where I said that with this globalization of the services market, we see also the rise of an independent worker. We are used to thinking in this industrial manner that people need to gather into enterprises to be more productive, and only this way we can achieve better wealth for societies. But we now see that there are more and more, there are millions of people independently offering their services online. And they are working in different countries at the same time. They are highly skilled, they are narrowly specialized, and they can be wherever. And I think we really need to start rethinking about how we see economy as a whole, because this industrial model is broken. The new global services market is coming in. The services and goods are getting intertwined, and actually, I mean, the part of good in the whole production chain is lesser than it used to be. The number of people working in industry will fall to maybe something like we see now in agriculture, and the person is more powerful on the market. And if we can play these trends well, then actually I believe that the power of people will help us to counterbalance these geopolitical big trends. I'm sorry to say that the time when 15 big men somewhere in one room, or 20 or 7, decided everything is gone. The new world is really billion-polar world.
And indeed, quite evident by the fact that Robert Kaplan is joining us from Massachusetts. You're in Tallinn, I'm in Berlin, and here we are having this conversation about the future. Your country, of course, Madam President, was, even before COVID-19, was a front runner, if not even a role model, when it came to digitalization, how to do it well. Do you think countries like yours are now successfully in a position, a pole position perhaps even, to succeed in what comes next?
I was able to serve my state as an advisor to Prime Minister when digitalization in Estonia started. And we thought we will have 5 years of advantage, and then the big ones will come rolling over our small advantages which we have created. And if we do start quickly, we may be able to have what the rest will have in 10 years with somewhat less cost to the state. How wrong we were. It's 20 years on, and still we don't see the basics in place for digital service provision globally. And I'm not only meaning public service provision, by which Estonia is mostly known, but I believe that all kind of safe and secure service provision in internet depends on safe identification. So as long as the world as a whole fails to recognize that there is not only a paper passport, but a digital identity or a digital passport, which will allow us to act and transact in an identified form online, this market cannot be totally open for everybody. And that's where I believe where Europe is ahead, because Europe has been able to recognize the need and has started to put into place the system of mutual recognition of digital identities. Without this becoming global, at least for developed economies, it is very hard to foresee how the power of technology could really be unleashed in order to create economic development, particularly at the times. And I don't think COVID-19 will be over and then nothing like this will ever happen. I think in the future, looking at the depletion of ecosystems and other problems we face on this planet, this will keep happening. We need to be able to serve each other.
Indeed. This title, Robert, this session is titled The World After COVID. I think we all wish we'd already be there, but we are still in the midst of a pandemic. When this is all said and done, Robert, which countries, which regions do you think will be best suited to come out of this, not unscathed, but certainly in a position to carry on and flourish?
Yes, I think there's an irony developing. We're seeing more and more great power rivalry, as I said before, between the US, China, and Russia. But at the same time, I believe all of these big countries have deep internal problems. The question is there even a Russian system that could replace President Putin? If Putin were to become ill tomorrow or in 5 years, is there even a stable system there? China has enormous tensions within its elite that seem opaque because it's not a democracy, but they're there nevertheless. And they're just as severe as in the United States. Of course, in the United States, you have severe internal tensions, as everybody knows. So all these great powers could weaken internally, and we could have a world in the 21st century where great powers will simply matter less. And a region like the Greater Indian Ocean, which does not have any great power on its shores, could easily become, a very significant part of the world. The same with Europe and other places. So it's kind of an irony. More and more great power tensions, but the great powers themselves are much more fragile than seems to be the case. And you could have sort of middle-level powers, like Germany, for instance, exert more and more influence in the world in the 21st century. It's not going to be a very clear, coherent situation. We're not going from one period of sort of imperial-like rule to another period like that. The 21st century is going to be incredibly complex, and power could be incredibly diversified.
Very complex situation indeed that is emerging in the 21st century. President Kaljulaid, this may be a bit of a philosophical question, but when the pandemic first started, I've read numerous reports and essays about how this is the moment for humanity, for us to come together and overcome our differences. If you look at the landscape today, has the pandemic, has COVID-19 really managed to bring us together, or has the opposite perhaps not even taken place? Has it not divided us even further due to socioeconomic hardship?
First of all, if we look, the socio-economic hardships and economic decline has not yet settled in. So we don't know yet whether there will be more protectionism, for example, or will we globally recognize that protectionism has never helped us and it will not help us also in the future. We don't know what will happen in economy. If we look right now, what we have is, lots of money being put into economy, and all this money accumulates in assets, real estate or elsewhere. So we are in the situation where we cannot predict from past trends what will happen in economy in this sense. And that means that we may face a new panic, which will then again result in unlikely, not so positive trends also for us globally. But some things have not changed through this pandemic, and I think they remain there. There was, for example, this big trend that Europe was facing up to the geopolitical reality of our big regional risk, Russia not being anymore the global big risk. There is also China, which means that other important players globally need to look at those other players as well, and Europe has to manage its regional risk itself. This has not changed through this pandemic. It will not change through this pandemic. And I'm happy to say that there is also no less attention through this pandemic on this issue. If you look the discussions here in Europe on Belarus, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, was very quick to say that sanctions could be considered. And Europe, while not intervening in internal politics of Belarus, is strongly standing together and demanding the right for Belarusian people to decide for themselves, east or west, democracy or less democracy. Seems to be democracy they want. They don't have European ambition, and fine with that, absolutely fine with that. They need to be able to decide. That is what Europe tries to achieve here. So I think some big trends have not changed, and maybe we are in general overestimating what has in reality changed. I still take this as a temporary issue in this sense that, it enhances digital trends, it maybe puts our attention less on geopolitical problems which we are facing, about which I'm quite sad, because I think we need to look at, for example, how NATO is ready to respond to the digital development of military forces outside NATO, and so on. We have issues with which we need to work, and which we are maybe neglected a little bit. But overall, half a year is probably too short as well.
Indeed, and hopefully this is just a temporary disruption and pandemic. Robert Kaplan, if we're looking at the major trends, if you were asked by an administration to give policy recommendations, not just for now, but for the time ahead, what would be your top 3 priorities for any government at this particular point to position itself so that it can come out both socioeconomically strong and viable?
I would say as it refers to the United States, I would tell the new administration, number 1, refurbish, re-strengthen alliances, reassure allies. That is the most important thing, because allies carry so much of the weight and alleviate a great power of so much of the burden. So that is number 1. The second thing, more generally, is it's not a matter of big government or small government. It's a matter of good government, of smart government, of government that is, that listens to experts, but where the politicians make the final decisions. So that, so it's a matter of getting better at micromanaging, so to speak, because we're going to have a lot. This is not the last pandemic we're going to have. We're going to have lots of issues. We could have, cyber attacks on a greater scale than we have seen so far. All this is going to take experts to kind of help us through. And the third thing is, and this is the most important thing, make sure that everybody in your society has a stake in the outcome, that they all feel that they have been taken into account and have not been brushed aside. In other words, on the one hand, strengthen democracy at the lower levels, but at the top end, improve administration, improve bureaucracy, because problems are going to come at us real fast, all kinds of problems, and governments are going to have quick reaction time. And that quick reaction time is dispersal of the responsibility to undersecretaries, to assistant secretaries, to deputy assistant secretaries. So you need the best people in any system to deal with ongoing crises. Crisis management is going to become permanent.
And following up on that, President Kaljulaid, you've been in office as president since 2016. Has the pandemic changed anything fundamental about the way you govern?
It has actually not changed anything in this sense that, for example, Estonian state reaches out to its people anyway digitally. All our services are online. You cannot marry online, but that's about it. People are demanding now already proactive services, which means that if the state knows that you are entitled to something, for example, universal child support, then the state should not demand you, even online, to make a demand, but should automatically reverse you what it is due to give you. So we were there already in this sense. What is new? Our schools, of course, had to also quickly adapt, and while we do have a lot of e-schooling elements in it, we also, of course, had not tested about how we teach our children if they are not in the school. But now we are having debates that maybe it's a valuable opportunity to have 1 day a week digital learning forever, for example. And we have been seeking to provide for our citizens living globally, which means we have been also developing Global Estonian School. And now it has a lot of new material in it because our teachers were preparing internet courses for several months now. So in addition to providing the state services globally for all Estonians, you can still vote wherever you are, etc. You can still, talk to your state, access your e-health system, all this while you are yourself in Australia, if you so wish. We now see that education is following these services into the internet. This is maybe the biggest change, and I really hope that these tools will allow Estonian children whose parents are, for example, working according to the free movement of labor in Europe, somewhere else, to fully educate themselves in Estonian language, having access to internet. So this is an enhancement. We also enhanced our e-health. For example, when people fell sick, they could start themselves their sick leave in e-health system. They didn't have to go to the doctor and ask the doctor to do it, and so on, so on. But these were modifications and upscaling. It was there already before.
Robert Kaplan, for the better part of the previous 6 months, the headlines have been dominated by the coronavirus. And as we said before, the United States, of course, finds itself in a very heated, very, very contested US election campaign right now. Is it fair to say that COVID-19 has changed the dynamics of the US elections? Up until then, Donald Trump's main ace was the economy, something that he obviously praised himself for numerous times and saw it as a biggest asset. Now, obviously, due to the socioeconomic ramifications of the pandemic, the game has a bit of change. Would you say that it's a very decisive factor in how Americans will vote in November?
Absolutely. COVID-19 is the crisis that has defined the Trump administration. Had there been no COVID-19, just think of the world we would be without COVID-19 regarding your question on the US elections. The American economy would be the strongest that it's ever been. You would not, the president would have gone through 4 years without something like the Iraq War, or some massive foreign crisis that would have defined him. It was actually, despite all the media hyperventilation about President Trump, the impeachment trials, all of that, nothing that much has happened in the first 3 years of the Trump administration. It was just a growing and generating economy. COVID-19 has changed that radically, and that will, affect the outcome of the election.
And obviously, Robert Kaplan, you say the COVID-19 has changed everything as far as the election campaign is concerned. But what does it say about the United States if a pandemic, you said, this is what the world and certainly the United States would look like if the pandemic hadn't happened. What does it say about the US if a pandemic, and within such a short amount of time, can throw the country so off the rails?
I think it's a culmination of something that people in Washington have been and around the country have been unwilling to face, which is America has had a crisis of leadership going back to the end of the Cold War. America's Cold War presidents, from President Harry Truman to President George H.W. Bush, have been, on the whole, far superior, especially in foreign affairs, than America's Cold War, post-Cold War presidents, from President Bill Clinton to Donald Trump. There have been variations, of course, that we can argue about, but as a group, America's Cold War presidents have performed magnificently better than its post-Cold War presidents. And that is not an accident. That reflects to the change in Washington, the change in American society, etc. That the post-Cold War, starting in 1989, has not been good for America in that sense. There's a line in Ernest Hemingway's first novel, The Sun Also Rises, where they asked someone, well, when did things start going, how did things go bad for you? And the banker said, first gradually, then suddenly. And I think that holds true for America's post-Cold War presidents. It was a gradual deterioration in the quality of administration, and then under President Trump, a sudden deterioration.
We're in the final stretches of the opening session. We have approximately 5 to 6 minutes left. I've been told that we have a question from one of our viewers. If we can get that in quickly, that'd be wonderful. So,
yes, is this me, Ian Anthony from SIPRI in Stockholm? I wanted to ask for your reflections on how international cooperation can be organized in the future. We've seen during the pandemic that there is criticism of international institutions and the way they perform. We don't see the world crystallizing, at least not yet, into a sort of block structure. But instead, we have sort of fluid issue-based coalitions of states around specific things, whether it's climate, health, military security. How can institutions reform themselves so that they can operate in this world? Will we just see a multiplication of institutions, even though they're criticized?
Madam President, you want to start first?
Well, I could. First of all, I know that sometimes we criticize our multilateral organizations, be the UN or European Union, for their slowness to react, for their inability to move quickly ahead and so on. And then I always ask people to compare, for example, Europe with the Union to Europe without the Union. If we then try to commonly respond to, for example, the challenge which was also mentioned in the question, climate change, it will look a little bit like the COP procedure. I mean, we will argue where will the next Congress be, then we will argue about how we will take decisions, and then when we take decisions, then there is no one to implement them. In European Union, even if Brussels quite and often looks like it's a mess, nobody, I mean, is getting what they want and not letting anybody else to get what the others want. This is not true. We have a system, the treaty, according to which we know when we come together, who comes together, how we take decisions, and then how we implement them thereafter. And this is how Europe has actually given the rest of the world hope that, for example, climate change can be fought successfully, because there is no other big enough and rich enough market which is collectively ready to exercise such a market distortion like climate neutrality by 2050. And by exercising, and I hope in a way where private sector and businesses will believe this pledge, by exercising this market distortion, it will make technologies to develop and become cheaper and cheaper until the rest of the world will use them because they are feasible. I don't see any other way, for example, how this planet can be changed. If European Union fails here, it will be a failure globally. So this is a demonstration how a multilateral institution can deliver in 21st century. Yes, it is the most rigid structure compared to other multilateral organizations, for example, UN. But despite the fact that people think it is not moving anywhere, it is, if you think about it.
Right. Robert Kaplan?
Yes. First of all, the United Nations, the organization of it, the Security Council, the General Assembly, reflects the world as it was in the late 1940s. And the General Assembly reflects the world as it was after the end of decolonization in the 1960s. It would be nice to think that the UN could be radically reorganized to reflect the new distribution of power and influence in the world today. Unfortunately, it will be very hard to do that without cooperation from the great powers. And cooperation from the great powers, you know, who have seats on the Security Council, that's why I mentioned them, you know, can only, you know, has to be achieved by their leaders. So the UN is a reflection of the world at large rather than a driver of the world at large, unfortunately. It's like the Congress of Vienna in the early 19th century. It reflects, you know, the power tensions. But I think, you know, that the UN, especially the European Union, even NATO, as much as it has been disparaged, are the building blocks for any restitution of international cooperation in this new age. And I would also include ASEAN in Asia. Our multilateral institutions are not perfect. They have a lot of problems, but they are there, they do function, and therefore it's best to try to improve them rather than to just to disparage them and throw them out.
We're almost out of time, Robert Kaplan, 60 seconds left. I don't want to pass up the opportunity, of course, to give you the opportunity to look into the famous crystal ball and give me your prediction regarding November. The next session that's coming up is titled Strengthening Transatlantic Cooperation in Times of Upheaval at 4 p.m. CET, moderated by my esteemed colleague, Steve Clements. What do you think is going to happen in November? Will we see a new president or 4 more years of Donald Trump, Robert Kaplan?
I've always been a believer in the silent Trump voter. You know, the voter who will not socially admit that he's going to vote for President Trump, but actually will, because they feel socially embarrassed if they do so in public with company. But the silent Trump voter is like 2-3% of the electorate. That I'll believe. But at the moment, President Biden, Vice President Biden, is ahead by almost double digits, by 8, 9, 10%. So that to me means, unless there's a dramatic shift, that we'll have a new president in November, because the silent Trump voter won't be enough to overcome that margin. Of course, a lot can happen between now and November. And, even the best forecasting agencies refuse to predict elections, because they can hinge on something that happens at the very, very last minute. But as of now, I would say even with the silent Trump voter, you have to give Vice President Biden the edge.
And we had a bit of a Freudian slip there, calling Joe Biden already, crowning him already the president, if not just verbally. No apologies needed whatsoever. Quite on the contrary, the jury's still out on the U.S. election in November, but the jury is still out on what the world will look like after COVID-19. After having listened to both President Kaljulaid and Robert Kaplan, though, I think we all have gotten great insights into what the world after COVID-19 could look like. Thank you so much to both of you, President Kaljulaid and Robert Kaplan, for your valuable insight. This wraps up the opening session of the GlobSec 2020 Digital Stage. It was a pleasure to moderate it, and looking forward to see you all again in person, hopefully before too long. All the best and stay safe.
Thank you.
GlobSec Bratislava Forum is the platform to tackle disruption and discuss solutions for better tomorrows.
The basic theme of disruption is crucial because, to me, the issue is not whether it's climate change or whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or whatever. It's actually the concatenation, the mix of them all. And that's what I think is so valuable about this, because it is a generalized conference.